I got back last Sunday from my annual visit to Europe. I went to visit my father, who lives in Malta, and then after that, after a week in Malta, I spent a week in the UK, and struggled a little bit through the week with jet lag. Monday in class, I sort of had to pinch myself to try to determine whether I was a human being or a vegetable. It wasn't so easy to discern, so it's been quite a week. But you may know that it's my custom once a year to go back to Europe. I was born in England, and my father lives in Malta. I go there once a year and spend a little bit of time to relax as well, a little bit of time with the church as well. And one of the things that I always notice when I'm in Europe, and some of you well-traveled brethren will identify with this, when you cross the Atlantic and you see what's going on in the world from the European perspective, things feel very different. And I remember being struck by this back in the 1980s, at the time of that terrible Iran-Iraq war that was so bloody and so evil. And I remember sitting in front of the big screen TV in the family home in North London and watching what was going on, and it feels much more immediate. It feels closer, you feel more threatened, and of course, as we've seen in the news over the last few months, there have been several terrorist attacks in Paris and London and Brussels, and a number of political developments. And when you're there, you feel impacted by it rather differently than the way you feel when you're here in Texas, in the middle of the United States of America. By a coincidence, last year, when I visited England, I arrived on the date of the Brexit referendum, Thursday, June 23rd of last year. And this year, I passed straight through London on my way to Malta, but it was the day of the general election on June 8th, 2017. And then when I was still in Malta, just before I went back to London, that was the day when the Grenfell Tower fire took place. And I note that in the news today, they're saying that they believe the number of dead is 89. So a lot of things have gone on. There have been terrorist attacks and so on, many things going on in the news. And here, of course, across the Atlantic, a lot of things going on as well. The country, it hardly bears stating, but the country is very, very divided, badly divided over a number of things, some of them substantive, other things seem to be just wars of words, unfortunately. And while the world faces very serious crises, there's an enormous amount of division and polarization here in the United States. In Syria, the news reports are saying that chemical weapons were used again. In Iraq, ISIS has reportedly almost been pushed out of the city of Mosul, one of the biggest cities in Iraq. You've got the North Korea crisis, a difficulty over health care. The Senate vote was delayed this week, and a lot of controversy concerning immigration and the travel ban, and there's a lot going on in the world today. One of the young men who applied for Foundation Institute this year, I read his autobiography. We have the applicants write a brief autobiography. And he commented, I thought the comment was very telling. He said that it appears that we live at a time when human history is accelerating. And I think that that observation was correct. A lot going on in the world today. And of course, we're very blessed, as was mentioned in the opening prayer, we're very blessed to have a beautiful hall here and to be able to come to worship in peace and in safety. But are we watching? Are we watching what's going on in the world? Let's turn to Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13. We're going to talk a little bit about prophecy this afternoon and about some of the things going on and some of the things to watch for. Mark chapter 13, and we'll begin reading here in verse 32. Mark chapter 13, verse 32 says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. The day and the hour of the time of Christ's return. Take heed, watch, and pray. You do not know when the time is. It is like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch, therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning. Lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping, and what I say to you, I say to all, watch. So Jesus Christ tells us to watch and to be aware of what's going on around us. Now, I've been here in the Dallas congregation for about 5 years, and I had the privilege of getting to know many of the brethren here. And there are many brethren here who are very well informed. In fact, some who write for our publications and write very incisive material about what's going on in the world. But at times also I wonder how many of us are kind of self-absorbed and walking around with our eyes closed. I wonder how aware we are of what's going on in the world. After I gave this sermon in Sherman this morning, one gentleman came up to me and said, well, the news is all so bad. And so my wife and I don't like to watch the news at all. Well, yeah, the news is bad. It is bad, and a lot of it is not very pleasant, but that shouldn't give us an excuse to cut ourselves off hermetically from everything that's going on around us. Prophecy moves forward. As we just read here in Mark chapter 13, there were different watches. You know, the watchman sat on the walls, and he had to be looking out all the way through the night for a chunk of time, and he had to force himself to stay awake. And Jesus tells us, you know, you don't know exactly in which watch I'm going to come. And as I look back in the history of the way we've understood prophecy in the church, sometimes I wonder whether we had the impression he was coming in the first watch. He didn't come in the first watch. We thought he was coming in the second watch. He didn't come in the second watch. We get to the third watch or even the fourth watch of the night, and by that time we've sort of shrugged and kind of pushed it all aside and maybe forgotten a little bit about prophecy. We were premature. Some of you who are veterans of the church know that we speculated, and it was a speculation, although some people took it as more than that, but the speculation was that Christ would return in 1975. Great Tribulation was supposed to have begun in the spring of 1972, and the return of Jesus Christ would be on the Feast of Trumpets of 1975, and it didn't happen. Though coincidentally, the Feast of Trumpets of 1975 was the very first holy day I ever kept in the church, and I got there and I heard all these people talking about what they had expected to have happen. And here we are, 42 years later, and sometimes I wonder, you know, have we kind of backed off a little bit too much and we've stopped watching what's going on in the world? Have we pushed it all aside? Have the prophesied events leading up to the return of Jesus Christ become bumper sticker and no more? Hopefully not. In some ways, the church really, a big chunk of the church came together as a result of the preaching of the prophetic message. That was the case with me when I came in contact with God's church as a teenager. And I wasn't looking for anything, a religious message, frankly. I wasn't looking for a church, but I heard someone on the radio talking about prophecy and talking about the end of the world and talking about the destruction of all humanity and the fact that God exists and he's got to intervene and he's going to change things. And I said, whoa. I've never heard this before, and it really caught my attention. Okay, so we live in very serious times, and here we are now, all these years later. And for those of you who are going to be taking notes on the sermon or just listening to the sermon, what I'd like to do is to divide the sermon into two parts. Number one, what to look for, and number two, how to look. What to look for and how to look. Jesus Christ tells us to watch. He tells us to watch. Our eyes need to be open. We need to be aware. We need to see what's going on around us. Number one, all sermons are supposed to have 7 points, right? So it's a 7-point sermon, and I'll tell you, I think I lost the numbers this morning, but I'm going to enumerate them as we go through. Number one, watch for the loss of Anglo-Saxon leadership. Watch for the loss of Anglo-Saxon leadership. It's Anglo-Saxon leadership that has led us through the last 70 years. It's Anglo-Saxon leadership that, frankly, has made it possible for us to be here, for the Church of God to be what it is today, here in the year 2017. But a lot of things have happened. Brexit came as a shock last year. A lot of people didn't expect it. Nobody thought that was going to happen. The mainstream parties in the United Kingdom and in the European Union all were pulling in the opposite direction. And the vote came down, and it was 51.9% against 48.1%. just a very small majority for leaving the European Union. And everyone was shocked. And I was reading the papers when I was in England, and it's all over the press because it's not clear what it implies. And the Brits are not in agreement about, even the ones who voted for Brexit, are not in agreement about what Brexit means. Some want to remain in the customs union and remain in the single market. Others say, no, we want out of this entirely. The business establishment is telling the Prime Minister, we need to remain in the customs union, otherwise we're going to have a very serious economic problem. The thing is, remaining in the customs union and remaining in the single market is almost the entirety of remaining part of the European Union. It's a nation that's very, very divided with regard to what it wants. You may have seen, I think it was about a couple of weeks ago, and Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council. I don't completely understand all of the different organisms of the European Union, but Donald Tusk, who is a man of Polish origin, he was giving a press conference after they'd met, I believe, in Brussels, and he quoted from a very famous political philosopher, John Lennon. And he was expressing the hope that the Brits would stay. And he said at the end of this interview, this presentation, he said, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. It's interesting because when you look across the panorama of politics in the European Union, there are those who are quite anti-British, and there are those who are pro-British and are still weeping over the fact that the Brits voted to leave. They're discussing this all over. It's all over the British press. It's on the British news. It's in the British newspapers. As you probably know, there was just recently a general election in which Prime Minister Theresa May had hoped to improve her majority. She had a 12-seat majority, and she lost her majority unexpectedly. It's very unclear how much strength she'll have to negotiate Brexit from this point forward. Someone in the press, I read it, I think it was just last week, talking about everything going on in the business world there in Britain, and said, since the Brexit vote, the Brexit decision has sucked the air out of British politics. It's sucked the air out. And as I said, there's a lot of disagreement, a lot of controversy, a lot of people still saying, we wish we hadn't voted this way, and a lot of people saying, let's get out of the European Union tomorrow. Let's cut the links entirely. And they're discussing hard Brexit and soft Brexit. A hard Brexit is a Brexit in which they break the links entirely and the trade goes back to World Trade Organization trade tariffs, which are relatively high and would have a pretty heavy impact on the trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union, its biggest trading partner, and maybe some kind of arrangement in which some kind of trade agreement could be set up. It's a big, big muddle. It's very uncertain. Here in the United States, the election of Donald Trump, of course, was very much unanticipated. He's a populist. He's loved by some and disliked by others, and we'll get to that briefly, but he's not very well liked in Europe. I don't recall hearing a single positive word about our president when I was even in England. Didn't discuss it much in Malta or anywhere else. But he's come at the head of a populist wave that, again, has gone against the grain of mainstream politics. The European Union is a huge economic conglomerate. I did a little bit of research. I've got it here in my notes somewhere. The population of the European Union at present, 743 million. If you subtract 65 million for the United Kingdom, you come to 578 million. Compare that with the United States of America, which is 321 million. And you begin to get a little bit of an idea of what the British are going to pull themselves out of. Even if you subtract that one from the 28, you've still got a huge number of human beings. And who's going to come into the leadership? We're watching things going on now. We should watch this, brethren. Who's going to come into the leadership? When the European Union was first founded, right after the war, it was the European Coal and Steel Community. Pardon me. It was the European Coal and Steel Community. It was the embryo of what later became the Common Market and later on became the European Union. And at the center of it was the German-French axis. Now, if you look at Germany and you look at France right now in Europe, France you see is a nation that has got an awful lot of challenges, and we'll talk about France in a moment. Germany has some challenges as well, but rather different ones. A strange kind of a challenge when you've got an enormous trade surplus, roughly 10% of the entirety of the trade is in surplus. And what is Germany saying? What's Germany saying? Quote, TheGuardian.com, May 28th this year. The times in which we could completely depend on others are, to a certain extent, over, Angela Merkel told an election rally in Munich on Sunday. I've experienced that in the last few days. We Europeans truly have to take our fate into our own hands. It's interesting, even within Germany, there's discussion about increased military expenditures. And the Social Democrats, the left of center opposition party, just a few days ago was saying, don't we remember our own history? Are we going to rearm? Continuing to read the quote. The Chancellor told the 2,500-strong crowd in the Bavarian capital that Germany and Europe would naturally strive to remain on good terms with the US, Britain, and other countries, quote, even with Russia. But she added, we have to know that we must fight for our future on our own, for our destiny as Europeans. The two-day G7 summit in Italy pitted the US president, whom Merkel did not mention by name, against the leaders of Germany, France, Britain, Italy, Canada, and Japan on several issues. So what we're seeing then is the beginning of a division between the United States and Europe. One of the things that one of the commentators commented when Donald Trump was inaugurated back in January, there was one thing he did not say in his speech that all presidents before him have said. He did not say, I'm the leader of the free world. And that hasn't gone unnoticed. He said, I'm the leader of America. And the rest of the world is, well, viewed differently by this administration. Now, another article that came my way recently, Jeff Caudle sent me this one, very interesting article, written by Nick Bryant, titled The End of the Anglo-American Order, bbcnews.com, June 9th this year. Quote, there's always been a shared conceit at the heart of the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom that global leadership is best expressed and exerted in English. More boastful than the Brits, successive U.S. presidents have trumpeted the notion of American exceptionalism. Prime ministers, in a more understated manner, have also come to believe in British exceptionalism, the idea that Westminster is the mother parliament and that the UK has a governing model and liberal values that set the global standard for others to follow, not least its former colonies. In the post-war Anglo-American order, those ideas came together. In many ways, it was the product of Anglo-American exceptionalist thinking. The city upon a hill meets this sceptered isle. NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, the Five Eyes intelligence community all stemmed from the Atlantic Charter signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in August 1941. The liberalized free trade system that flourished after the war is often called the Anglo-Saxon model. The post-war world global architecture, diplomatic, mercantile, and financial, was largely an English-speaking construct. In recent weeks, however, the Anglo-American order has looked increasingly weak and wobbly. The unexpectedly messy result of the British election makes it look still more fragile. Theresa May lost her majority. Like a historic edifice left tottering in the wake of a major quake. There is uncertainty in Westminster and something nearing chaos in Washington because of the Russian probe at the White House and on Capitol Hill. Neither Britain nor America can boast strong and stable governments. Neither have the look of global exemplars. In the 6 weeks since Theresa May called her snap election, the global tectonic plates have shifted fast, leaving Britain and America increasingly adrift. Donald Trump, during his first international trip, refused to publicly endorse Article 5 of the NATO treaty and publicly scolded his allies over financial burden sharing. He found himself isolated at the G7 summit in Sicily. Then, on his return to Washington, came the announcement that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, a decision of massive planetary and geopolitical import. Here, America first meant America alone, and Trump seemed to revel in his neo-isolationism, as he did when he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership early in his presidency. For Britain, the diplomatic impact of Brexit has also become clearer in recent weeks. EU leaders have bluntly outlined how they will set the terms of the divorce settlement in what looks more like a diktat than an amicable separation. The 27 remaining members of the EU have made it clear they intend to penalize the UK. When Jean-Claude Juncker met Theresa May at Downing Street shortly after she called the election, he was evidently dismayed by her approach. Quote, "I'm leaving Downing Street 10 times more skeptical than I was before," said the EU Commission President. As one senior EU diplomat put it to me, Britain has shot itself in one foot. We intend to shoot you in the other. The British Prime Minister, by failing to win an election she didn't have to call, has weakened her bargaining position still further. Brexit negotiator Guy Verhofstadt has already called the UK election yet another own goal. Europe eyes an enhanced role for itself too. We Europeans must really take our fate into our own hands, declared Angela Merkel during a speech in a Bavarian beer hall after the disastrous G7 summit. In a pointed dig at America and Britain, she warned that the days when Germany could completely rely on others are, quote, over to a certain extent. More and more, the German Chancellor looks like the leader of the free world, something that would have required a massive leap of imagination in the years immediately after World War II, when the English-speaking liberal global order was taking shape. Winston Churchill, during the 1946 speech in Fulton, Missouri, in which he coined the phrase special relationship, and also the phrase the Iron Curtain, noted, "It is necessary that constancy of mind, persistency of purpose, and the grand simplicity of decision shall guide and rule the conduct of the English-speaking peoples in peace as they did in war. We must, and I believe we shall, prove ourselves equal to this severe requirement." Right now, both the United States and the United Kingdom seem to be failing that Churchillian test. These English-speaking nations no longer speak with such a clarion voice, and the rest of the world no longer takes such heed. A new world order seems to be emerging that is being articulated in other tongues. The End of the Anglo-American Order by Nick Bryant. I'd like to turn to Revelation chapter 12. Let's go to Revelation chapter 12. I went through the book of Revelation recently as part of my own study, and I've read this chapter, as I imagine you have, a number of times and given sermons on this chapter. But there's something that struck me in the first 3 verses of Revelation 12 that I think we shouldn't overlook. It's really very obvious, but let's read the beginning of Revelation chapter 12 because it tells something about the geopolitics of the world and about leadership in the world. Revelation 12, verse 1, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. And doesn't that look like Joseph's dream back in the book of Genesis, which we studied in class this week? This is, of course, symbolic of the nation Israel. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and gave pain, in pain to give birth. She's preparing to give birth to Jesus Christ the Messiah. Verse 3, "And another sign appeared in heaven." And what struck me is what's really very obvious. Here's the first sign. Here's this woman with the 12 stars and so on, the sun and the moon, symbolic of Israel, and the entire system that goes along with it, and this system that really has made it possible for us to be here today and for the church to do what it's been able to do. We'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And then in verse 3, it's a different sign, another sign. "A great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems or crowns on his heads." And of course we understand from many of the prophecies, because the terminology is very similar in other parts of the book of Revelation, that this is talking about the Roman system based in Europe. The point that I'm making is that they're 2 separate systems and they are not compatible. They are not compatible. We know that clearly from Bible prophecy. So that's watch number 1. Watch number 1, the slow shrinkage, or perhaps the somewhat fast shrinkage of Anglo-American influence in the world. Watch number 2, and we've already touched on this a little bit, is the slow awakening of Europe. We read some of those quotes from Angela Merkel. It's a huge trade surfeit that they've got. There's an enormous difference. You know, they're exporting a huge amount of goods out of Germany, and of course it's all done in the form of the euro, and the euro is not a single nation currency. Therefore, Germany is benefiting very greatly from a euro which, at least from the German perspective, is underpriced. But Europe has been a blind spot in American foreign policy through many different administrations, both Democrats and Republicans. Recently, over the last 20 years or so, the attention has been directed toward places like China in particular, because of the size of the Chinese market, the potential size of the economy. More recently, the tilt has been toward Russia because of all the controversy concerning Russia. But it's kind of a blind spot, and it should not be, and it should not be for us. Because we know about Bible prophecy. We know what Bible says. Watch number 2, watch Europe. And we take note of the surprise election in France. All of a sudden along comes a young man, because a lot of the European political leaders are almost fossilized. 39 years old, charismatic, good-looking, Emmanuel Macron. Where was it? I was recently. I was watching I was in someone's home, and they had cable TV, and I was watching the debate between Macron and Le Pen in the French language. I think there may have been some subtitles, but very, very articulate, upstart president comes along, and he wins the presidency, and then everybody says, I don't know whether this guy can even have enough politicians behind him, and he had to form his own party, En Marche. And guess what? They won an overwhelming majority in France. The interesting thing here is that, of course, as I've already mentioned, when you go back into the history of the European Union and the European Economic Community prior to the European Union, and before that, the European Coal and Steel Community, it was the Franco-German axis that was at the center of it. The Franco-German axis held it together, these two big economies in continental Europe, and is likely to continue to hold it together, although France is a nation that has tremendous difficulties, an awful lot of challenges Macron is going to have to face. But very likely that Franco-German axis will remain the center of things. Revelation 17. Revelation chapter 17. Watch what goes on in Europe. We used to say that very loudly in the church, didn't we? Let's not forget about it. We're much closer to those events. Revelation chapter 17. Let's read verse 8. Let's read verse 8. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. This is the Roman system that keeps coming back to life over and over again, and will do in the last days. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, taken by surprise. Hopefully that's not us. Whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Verse 9, here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Now, there's a surprising number of cities around the world built on 7 hills. I learned when I lived in Ohio that Cincinnati, Ohio, is known as a city built on 7 hills. This is not Cincinnati, Ohio. Rio de Janeiro in Brazil is built on 7 hills. This is not Rio. No, it's very obvious whom John is speaking about. It's the Roman system. Verse 12, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet. Notice 10 kings. 28 nations in the European Union at present. Subtract 1, you're down to 27. How do we get from 27 to 10? I don't know for sure. But I'm going to present an idea shortly about something I think we need to keep an eye on. But they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. Doesn't go on for very long. The book of Revelation emphasizes that. This doesn't go on too long. The book of Revelation is written for God's people with reassurance in it. When you see these things take place, be reassured, because it doesn't last that long. And that will be the good news when some of that misery comes on the world. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. This is not a democratic action. This is kings delivering up their authority to a European strongman. Verse 14, these will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And I hope that describes me, and I hope that describes you, and I hope that describes all of us. But what we learn from this passage of Scripture is that the last great power on earth at the time of the return of Jesus Christ will be this European power referred to as the beast. Again, I mentioned it's a little bit of a blind spot, isn't it? Many of the even recent American administrations, both Democrat and Republican, have given only very limited attention to Europe. We should not. We should watch what's going on there. A lot of things are taking place there at present. So watch number 2 is watch what goes on in Europe, the European ascendancy, which is perhaps just beginning to take place. Watch number 3 is attitudes toward Americans. There's a rising tide of anti-Americanism once again around the globe. I heard that there was one of the polls in Germany gave a popularity rating of about 5% to our current president. Some of the numbers are a little bit higher. I discovered he's not well liked in England. I don't remember talking with anyone who spoke positively of him. I'm sure there are people like that, but I didn't come across any. He represents a different set of values. Culturally, he's very, very different from Europe. Here's another article that I found from GatesstoneInstitute.org. Donald Trump and the return of European anti-Americanism. European anti-Americanism, which was on the wane during the presidency of Barack Obama, who steered the United States on a course of globalism rather than nationalism, is back with a vengeance. Europe's media establishment has greeted Donald Trump's election victory with a vitriol not seen since the George W. Bush presidency, when anti-Americanism in Europe was at fever pitch. Since the American election on November 9th, European television, radio, and print media have produced an avalanche of negative stories, editorials, and commentary that seethe with rage over the outcome of the vote. Now remember, this is after the vote, but before his inauguration. European criticism of Trump goes far beyond a simple displeasure with the man who will be the next president. The condemnation reveals a deep-seated contempt for the United States and for American voters who democratically elected a candidate committed to restoring American economic and military strength. If the past is any indication of the future, European anti-Americanism will be a pervasive feature of transatlantic relations during the Trump presidency. And that would appear to be the case. And you know, that's been there in Europe. It's been latent. Sometimes it's come to the surface. Other times it's below the surface. I think very likely over the next few years it's going to begin coming back to the surface again, as politically and culturally it seems that Europe and the United States veer away from each other. Matthew 24, verse 9, one verse here. Matthew 24 and verse 9. And I can remember hearing Herbert W. Armstrong preach from the Olivet Prophecy, and a point that he made sticks in my mind, Matthew 24 and verse 9, because of course the context really is Jesus Christ talking to his disciples, but let's read the verse first. Matthew 24, verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Now, he's talking to his disciples, but I remember the point that I heard preached many years ago, that this actually applies, and I believe this to be true, both to physical Israel and spiritual Israel. One of the things that we need to understand is that physical Israel and spiritual Israel are really tied at the hip. We really are. Our ability to do what we do, our freedoms that we enjoy, it's July 4th weekend, the freedom of religion, the prosperity and so on that we have in North America, really pretty remarkable. And you get to Europe, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but you get to Europe and Europe has a very, very different attitude toward religion. Anyway, watch number 3, watch the rising tide of anti-Americanism. I think that's likely to increase in some parts of the world, Europe and Latin America and probably elsewhere as well. Watch number 4 concerns religion. religion. I had an interesting conversation 2 weeks ago today. I was in Tonbridge, England, where we have a very small but very friendly congregation there. And I was talking, one of the families there has 3 young boys, 2 of whom have come to the United States for the Kagwa summer camps. And I was asking them about their impressions of America. And the oldest of the young boys made a very interesting comment. He said when he came to the Kagwa summer camps and when he saw the Americans, one of the things he noted was how interested in religion Americans are. Now, I know we think, well, American religion is going down the tubes, but in actual fact, when you look at the southern states of the United States, it's still a very, very churchy, a very religious part of the world. Religion has not completely died off in this part of the country yet. Mr. Beach was talking about that in his sermonette, and certainly in other parts of the country, there's a lot less interest in religion. But in the southern parts of the country, there's still a good bit of church influence. When you get to Europe, you see a very great disinterest in religion. In fact, young Western Europeans are almost hostile toward religion. You talk to them about the Roman Catholic Church, and now I realize I'm generalizing here, but they don't even want to know about it. And the family home in North London, there's a little church on the north side of the street in Southgate where the family home is, and I walk past every now and then, and it looks so desolate. It looks so sad. You know, they would have loved to have had the number of people and the energy and the young people and so on and the families that we have here in the Dallas Church of Kagwa. The point being that interest in religion is largely absent in Western Europe. It's interesting. It's the immigrant communities, the people who've come from Africa and the people who've come from the Caribbean, who are the ones who are interested in religion, organized religion. Generally, the Anglo-Saxon, the white Anglo-Saxon people have lost all interest. And apparently the Church of England has done very little to retain their interest. The Roman Catholic Church is, in many parts of the world at present, going through an awful lot of difficulty. You maybe read about Cardinal George Pell in the news this week. Did you catch that? I didn't know that Catholicism is the biggest religion in Australia. I was unaware of that. And it said that in the press a number of times. I think it's about 16% of Australians are Catholics. That doesn't sound like a very high number, but presumably the others, the Protestants and the Muslims or whatever, are smaller numbers. Anyway, the Roman Catholic Church is not really appealing to a lot of people in Europe at present. The exception, and in conversations with some of our people in Britain and some friends in Britain, the exception actually is a slight increase in church attendance in Britain because there's such a large number of Polish immigrants. And of course, the Poles are almost universally Roman Catholic. They've pushed the numbers of church attendance up a little bit because of the Poles. But so it's kind of sort of lying asleep at present, at least apparently in some ways. And yet if you watch what this Pope has said, he's also appealing to a populist chord, just like some of the politicians of the world. You remember that comment that he made that kind of shocked everyone. Well, who am I to condemn gay people? And everyone was shocked that a Pope would say such a thing. And going around and washing the feet of the poor and visiting prisons in Latin American countries. The point that I'm making is that with that kind of groundwork, things can change very quickly. Things can change very, very quickly. Revelation 13. So here is watch number 4, watch religion. Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 through 13. And watch in particular the Roman Catholic Church. It's still very much there, going through some great difficulties at present, but it's not going away, that's for sure. Revelation 13, and beginning in verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke like a dragon. And some people know how to distinguish between the voice of the dragon and the voice of the lamb, capital L. We do, we hope. That's why we hear. But a lot of people don't. Verse 12, he exercises all the authority of the first beast, that's the governmental, the political structure, in his presence, and he causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs. In John's writings, the word signs means miracles. And so we know this is going to take place in the future. We know there's going to be a revival, if you will, of religion in Europe. We know that there will be a time when the leader of the European Catholics will work miracles. Look at what he's going to do. So that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And you know, we've talked about that a lot in class, and we've talked about the biblical criteria for determining whether somebody who comes along who works miracles really is of God. And we're Church of God people. Hopefully we know that. We understand that. But you know what's going to happen. The overwhelming majority of people are going to say, if he does that kind of thing, he's got to be a man of God. And probably the enormous lack of knowledge of the Bible, especially among young Europeans, this very secular, young Western European generation that has come along. And when these things take place, the fact that they don't know what the Scriptures say is going to provide fertile soil for a deception. And many people are going to say, he must be a man of God. How can he possibly not be a man of God? We, I hope, will not be taken in. We shouldn't be. We know better. But those things could happen very quickly, brethren. That's the point that I'm making here. It could happen very quickly. So watch number 4 is watch what goes on in the religious sphere in Europe. It's not really stirring at this point, but it could do. Populist appeal from a religious leader could stir things very quickly, especially when combined with calling fire down from heaven. It's going to impress an awful lot of people. Now, for point number 5, I'd like to stay in Revelation chapter 13 and go toward the end of the chapter, verses 16 through 18. Revelation 13, 16 through 18. These will be verses that we all know rather well, I'm sure, and a lot has been written about this, and people have sold books and produced DVDs about the mark of the beast. But there's a question here, an interesting question. Revelation 13, verse 16. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. It goes on the right hand. Most people are right-handed. This is where your physical strength is, or on your forehead, the seat of the intellect, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. It's actually one of 3. You don't have to take the mark of the beast to participate in it. If you've got the name of the beast, maybe even a personal acquaintance with him, we don't know, or the number of his name. And then we get verse 18, this very famous verse. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. It's the number of a man. His number is 666. And of course, there's been a lot written about that down through the ages by us and many others. But there's another question that I'd like for us to think about here. As I already mentioned, the European Union at present has 28 nations in it. If the Brits do withdraw, which appears very likely they will, it'll be down to 27. It's unlikely the European Union will accept new members in the immediate future. So you've got 27 nations. And yet, as we just read in Revelation 13, this power in the last days that grows up in Europe has 10 nations. 10 kings, 10 kingdoms. Question, how? How do you get from the 27 or 28 to the 10? And the answer, of course, is we don't know for sure. What we read in the Bible, what we're reading about in the Bible, it's important to understand is a command economy. We read about a command economy, not a free trade system. You know, in Western Europe today now, taxes are much higher. The state takes a lot more. It's more a social democratic model, that's true. But nevertheless, there is a lot of free trade going on, and you can essentially buy anything that you want in Germany, France, Italy, England, wherever. But what we read about is a command economy. You've got some big guy, some supreme leader saying, you don't participate in this system unless you have the mark of the beast or the name or the number of his name. How do we get from where we are now to what the Bible describes? We don't know for sure, but I'd like to give you a suggestion. This is just my opinion. I can't prove this. I think time will tell. But one of the very big challenges on the economic scene at present is the matter of debt. Debt is a huge potential earthquake or volcano, whatever metaphor you want to use, especially in North America and in Europe in particular. A quote, CNBC.com, global debt balloons to an all-time high of $152 trillion. That's a lot of money. That's huge. The world is awash with $152 trillion of debt, according to the International Monetary Fund, an all-time high, which sits at more than double the balance at the start of this century, this 21st century. So it's more than doubled in 16, 17 years. This debt mountain, as of 2015, represents 225% of gross domestic product, up from 200% in 2002, and signifies the extent to which increases in borrowing have outpaced economic growth during the period. 225% of gross domestic product, that's the world. In other words, if everybody stopped spending every last penny they earn on the face of planet Earth, and every last penny went to paying off the debt, it would take over 2 years to pay it off. Obviously, that's not going to happen. While the Washington, D.C.-based organization emphasized that there is no exact science to knowing how much debt is too much, it has urged governments in certain countries to tackle excessive private debt levels. It's interesting. Actually, I think you can get on the Economist's website. I did this last night or yesterday in the office. You can get on their website, and they've got a kind of a debt clock. And it's showing the numbers, and the numbers twirl so fast, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars every minute or so. It was moving too fast for me to keep up with it, showing the total amount of debt in the entire world. Now, of course, there's a message, if we want, for us as well, that we need to be careful of that individually. But nevertheless, here's my speculation. Because the economists say, we don't know how this can be managed. Something goes wrong all of a sudden, and the world economy contracts, and you've got a big, big problem. What happened in 2008, when the economy went bad throughout much of the world, of course, what happened, the system was flooded with extra dollars and with extra euros. And when you look for those debt ratios, they're really high in this country and in many of the countries of Western Europe. They've increased fastest in the developing world, but they're very, very high in the United States of America and Canada and in Western Europe. They're enormous. So some kind of shrug it off. What difference does it make? If the economy is growing, it's fine. Well, that may be true, maybe not. But what happens when all of a sudden you have another hiccup, as took place in 2008, when the economy suddenly shrank and the property prices crashed in this country? We don't know, but something for us to keep our eyes on and to be aware of, because it's not making a whole lot of press. Watch the matter of debt. In this country, it's largely federal government debt now. And by the way, the government shuts down in October unless they raise the debt ceiling again. And in Europe, it's a little bit different. A lot of it has to do with the banking system. The banking system in Italy is teetering on the edge. It's very dysfunctional. And in Greece, of course, they keep on renegotiating the debt. And what do? You kind of push it out again. Who pays? Number one, Germany. How long are they going to be content to continue to refinance the Greek debt? Now, Greece is a very small proportion, very small part of the European economy, but nevertheless, you've got difficulties throughout the European Union and throughout Western Europe generally. And it's countries like Germany, to some extent Finland and the Netherlands, which are being asked to finance the debt problem in Western Europe. Add to this some of the protectionist policies, which may well lead to slower growth and a sudden contraction of the world economy. And this is something we need to keep our eyes on. Isaiah 42, verse 14. Isaiah 42, verse 14. Isaiah 42 and verse 14. Looks to me as if God will work in the way that he describes here in this verse. Isaiah 42 and verse 14. God says through Isaiah here, I've held my peace a long time. I've been still and restrained myself. Now I will cry like a woman in labor. I will pant and gasp at once. It's interesting how many scriptures hint at the fact that when the prophetic wheels begin to turn, they turn very quickly. And the wheels haven't really begun to turn yet, but they could turn very quickly. We shouldn't get ahead of the game. I want to get to point 7, which has to do with our work. But let's get to point number 6. Point number 5 was watch the economy, watch for debt. Point number 6 was watch morality and the breakdown of the family. You know, it's funny, when you travel between your birth country and your country where you live, in my case, the UK and the United States, and you've only been there once a year, the thing that is really striking is the cultural changes and the changes in which people, in how people think. And what really struck me again this year, going back to England, is that marriage is almost totally overturned. It's been almost completely abolished in many circles of British society. Remember, Britain is not churchy in the way that the United States is, and especially the southern states of the United States, where you've still got people preaching about the sanctity of marriage, and a significant part of the population still believing that, and a significant number of people who reject the idea that you've got 57 different varieties of gender identity. You know, they talk, I think, in the New York City schools, or, you know, they've got all these different varieties. It's not just boys and girls anymore. It's over 50 different descriptions. It's terrible. But you see the breakdown of the family. Most young people are very happy to live together outside of marriage. The acceptance of homosexuality. Did you see, just a couple of days ago, they legalized it in Germany, and Angela Merkel voted against. I think it was yesterday, actually. So things are moving very, very quickly. Morality breaks down. Morality breaks down. That's watch item number 6. Watch the breakdown of morality. 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3, it's an interesting section. I'm not going to read all the way through it, but I just want to pick up a couple of words that the Apostle Paul uses here to describe people in the last days. 2 Timothy chapter 3. And verses 1 and 2, Paul writes to Timothy, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come." Part of that peril, much of the peril, is from the breakdown of the family. When families begin to break apart, you've got all of the other social problems that go along with them. Crime, budgetary problems, because a lot of the responsibility for what families should be doing is pushed onto the state. For verse 2, "Men will be lovers of themselves," and we could say women as well. And when you look at all of these things going on, at the core of it, the heart of these things, the breakdown of the family, the loose living, the acceptance of promiscuity, is selfishness, frankly. And you see so many examples of it. Verse 3, unloving is mentioned there. In the middle of verse 2, disobedient to parents, also very, very common. Watch morality. Watch the breakdown of the family. Watch how selfishness leads to broken families. Let's go to Malachi chapter 4. Malachi chapter 4. I don't want to make this all a negative sermon, but sadly many of the things going on in the world are negative and are very troubling. But the Elijah prophecy, Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Again, this is part of our work, something that we have to do. And I would say this, that from my perspective as a person who doesn't have a family, but watching many of the families here in the Dallas congregation and elsewhere, I do think many of the families in the Church of God are doing a very, very good job in rearing their kids. I know it's not easy. It's not easy when they hear things in school, but I think many of the families are doing very, very well and really set the example, model an example for the way families should be. Yeah, I know your family's not perfect, but I mean that sincerely. Malachi 4, verse 5, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a cherem," with a curse, with a ban of utter destruction. That reunification of families, binding them together, is that important to God. We hopefully have that in the Church of God. I know we battle with it. I know we have difficulties in God's church as well, but I also know that the track record is in many ways a good one. There are many good marriages in the church. There are many good families, and there are many, many parents who are doing a tremendous job in rearing their kids in circumstances that are not easy. I saw it with this family in Tonbridge, England, 3 very nice young men, and I asked them, by the way, in the course of the conversation, I said, when you go to the Feast of Tabernacles, do you tell any of your friends where you're going? No. Any of your teachers? Do you have any of your teachers who are, Church of England or Adventist or Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever, believers? No. Can't talk religion at all. What happens if you talk religion? Oh, they just poke fun at you. It's a subject, it's a no-go area in England. Nevertheless, they're very nice family that I ran into. I've known them for a little while there. Anyway, back to point number 6. Point number 6 is watch the breakdown of morality. Watch the breakdown of the family. It's become so common now around us, and of course, it's part of our responsibility to resist that and to put into effect in our lives, whoever we may be, men, women, married, single, with families, without families, godly morality as described in the Bible. But that's a struggle, the way things are going. Watch number 7 is the work of the church. Now, in point number 5, I talked about the possibility of an economic crisis leading to that mark of the beast described in Revelation 13. We need to qualify it a little bit. We need to qualify it, because to state the obvious, and we know that will come. We know the Bible talks about a time when there will be a famine of the word, and we will not be able to get the gospel out in the same way that we've been able to do now and had the freedom to do over so many decades. We have to take advantage of that time, and I believe God will not allow that to take place, that complete breakdown, until he says, okay, the gospel has gone out enough, it's been heard, it's now time to move forward. Let's go to Matthew 28. Matthew 28. Watch number 7 is watch the progress of the gospel. That's internal, that's not external, but it's very, very important. Matthew 28, right at the end of the chapter, the Great Commission, these wonderful words from Jesus Christ, the living Jesus Christ, because he is alive, he is our Savior, he is the head of the church, he is alive, and he tells us that he goes with us all the way up to the end. And isn't that great news? Matthew 28, verse 18. Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And we look forward to the time when that authority will be exercised by him as God's kingdom is instituted. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations. I receive some of the personal correspondence in the office that comes in the Spanish language, and we get messages from all over the place in Latin America, including a number of places where we don't have congregations. And we get quite a response. We've had a response recently from a lady in Cuba. 10, 15 years ago, it was very difficult to get any kind of internet in Cuba. It was too heavily controlled. It's slowly begun to open up. I think internet penetration in Cuba is now about 4%. That's not high, I know. But this lady has a computer, and she's got on the internet, and somehow she found Vida, Esperanza y Verdad. And she's written, and I've had the privilege of writing back to her. She says, this is amazing. She says, I've never seen anything like this before. She says, you folks teach exactly what the Bible says. Yeah, that's right. That's what we're trying to do. And she says, I've downloaded everything except for the videos. She says, I don't have enough bandwidth to download the videos. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations. She writes and she says, I want to set up a house church, a Vida, Esperanza y Verdad house church. Come, my husband has a car, you can come and visit, so maybe I'll have the chance to go and visit her someday and maybe even baptize her. I'd like to do that. Make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you. And the end of verse 20 here, of course, is the very important thought here. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Watch the progress of the gospel. The work that's being done through our media team, through the ministers who write, the material that's being produced is very good. It's very, very good. I had an interesting conversation last week. I was together for lunch with a gentleman whom I've known for many years. He has the same faith as us, but he's not in the same fellowship with us. And he's followed all of our publications. And we were discussing this. And I think he gets on our website occasionally. I said, you should get on the website. I said, because I think we've learned a lot of the lessons of the past. And I think the publications now are really very, very good. And they're reaching a lot of people. What are those numbers? I didn't bring all the stats with me, but approaching 1 million unique unique visitors per month at times, 750,000, 800,000, numbers like that. That's a lot of human beings who are reached with the message that you and I are instrumental in taking to the world. It hasn't yet brought a bumper crop. There are some new people in the church. We pray for that there would be a bigger crop. But whatever the case, there is an impact to what's being done. And the thought here, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. And like you, I disagreed very strongly with people that I talked to 25 years ago who said the preaching of the gospel is over. Because a man whom we respected so highly died, and then we ran into internal difficulties, and people said, no, it's over. The preaching of the gospel is over. And guess what? Here we are now, all those years later, and we've got young people coming into Foundation Institute who were born long after Herbert W. Armstrong died. All of the controversies, all of the splits in the church, which sometimes we talk about a little bit too much, are sort of ancient, cobwebby history to many of those young people, and they want to learn our faith. And there are people outside there who still want to learn the truth. The fields, I think, are not as white as they once were, because many people in the Western world are not biblically interested in the way they once were. Although it's interesting, even in Britain, there's a notable evangelical community. It's present. There are Adventists, there are Jehovah's Witnesses. I was sitting in a family home one Sabbath morning working on my notes, and a knock came on the door, and this lady was there, and I could tell who she was. You know, she's got a copy of the magazine in her hand, and she was a Jehovah's Witness going out doing her missionary work. And I said to her, I'm a member of one of the Seventh-day Churches of God. I said, have you ever heard of that? And she nodded. She said, yes, I have. And she said, well, she said, it's good to meet someone of a like mind. And I didn't beat her over the head with the fourth commandment. Maybe I should have done. No. She seemed like a nice person. But anyway, the point that I'm making is that the work that we're doing is having an impact. And some of the things that we've talked about very likely will not take place until God says, no, there's still a work to be done. Because when those things take place, we're not going to be able to do the work. It's over. So point number 7, watch number 7, is watch our work. I believe there's yet a work to be done. We've got good publications from the church, and I really like the Discern magazine. The articles, the layout is good, the way it's presented is very good, the articles are short and snappy, they have energy to them. That's the way you have to present our message in the year 2017. Otherwise, we all know what happens. People tune out. They're on their smartphones. They'll give you 1/10 of a second if you're lucky. All right, I mentioned at the end how to watch world events. And I want to make a point here, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but I read an article recently. I was listening to someone who said that people who consume media are now determining what the media will tell them. It used to be the media shaped public opinion. Now, public opinion is shaping the media. Have you noticed that? All of the talk of fake news, people on the left who'll take their news only from sources on the left, people on the right who take their news only from sources on the right. And, I really think that's not a good trend. You know something? If a liberal tells you the sky is blue, it's true. If a conservative tells you the sky is blue, it's true. If a fascist tells you the sky is blue, it's true. If a communist tells you the sky is blue, it's true. The point that I'm making is that as we watch what's going on in the world, as intelligent people informed in what the scriptures say, we should have the ability to filter the news that comes our way. Fox News is not the ultimate badge of spirituality. I know some people think they've got to have Fox News on all the time, and maybe you get put out of the church if you don't. Sorry, I'm being a little sarcastic. But, no. We should get our news, we should be informed from many different sources, and I know there are people out on the extremes who have all kinds of nutty ideas. I'm not talking about things like that. Let's get good quality publications. As members of God's church, we need to be informed. I know we don't have a whole lot of time. I know we've got kids in school, we've all got work and so on. But sometimes I worry because I think, well, when some of these prophesied events come to pass, are some members of the church going to suddenly say, oh, I knew nothing about this? I sure hope not. We should never say, I knew nothing about this. And in order to avoid saying, I knew nothing about this. We've got to have our eyes open now. That means a measure of watching what's going on in the world. We can't be parochial. We can't be inside our own little shell, hermetically sealed off from the world and unaware of what's going on. So we need to get news from different sources. Truth, sift it out, filter it. I used to get the Financial Times, very good newspaper. I didn't renew it because it's kind of expensive, but I used to get the Financial Times, lots of very good news. And I was kind of surprised on their opinion page how much their opinions actually came from left of center, especially on world politics. It surprised me. I get the Wall Street Journal every day and try to read it. Can't always get to it every day. And I'm surprised about their opinion page. Their opinions, surprisingly, almost always seem to come from right of center. The point I'm making here is that we should be able to filter it out. Wherever somebody is in the political spectrum, if they say something that's true, it's true. If they say something that's false, it's false. And we should be well informed enough that we know how to reject fake news, and fake news isn't necessarily fake news as it's being described by one or the other. Hopefully, we're not shaping the media that we receive. It should be the reverse. We should see what's going on in the world, get good quality media, sound information, and then filter it and find out what's really going on. I read the Wall Street Journal every day. I don't have shares in it, but I find it to be a good publication. In the office, we get The Week, which is a very good brief publication with short articles, gives a good bit of insight. I think we get The Economist in the office as well. I don't get it. It's a big read, but a very good read. CNN.com is quite good. Yes, they're somewhat left of center, but again, one can filter. BBC.com is very good. It'll give you the European perspective, and you'll get that feel for what I mentioned at the beginning of the sermon about how news feels different from a European perspective. Now, in BBC.com, again, you're often going to get, in some areas, a left of center. In most areas, I think, a left of center perspective, but nevertheless, it's a very good source of news. And there are many others that we could mention. The Drudge Report, he has a link. He has links to just about everything. You can get news from the North Korean news agency if you like, if you want a good laugh. That would be fake news. I would certainly grant that is fake news. But the Drudge Report, he's got all of these links to lots of different news outlets, and you can get on one page on the internet and get lots and lots of information there. But filter the information that you get. Evaluate it. Is it good? Is it sound? Is it true? And don't reject it simply because somebody who votes in another direction says it. You've got to find out whether it's true. The point being that we need to stay awake, we need to stay alert. It is very important that we as members of God's church are aware of what's going on in the world around us, because ultimately these things will have an impact on us. And ultimately when we see those things taking place, when we see the wheels turning, we know the kingdom of God is near. See, we've got the hope. We've got the hope. The world doesn't, and we've got to share it with the world. Let's finish with the words of our Savior in Matthew 24. I think this is the best way to finish it. Matthew chapter 24, beginning in verse 32. Matthew 24, verse 32. God must have a sense of humor because I've got a fig tree in my backyard. I bought a house in Allen. It's got a fig tree there. It's producing lots of figs. Wonderful ripe figs, and the birds were having a feast this morning, and I haven't had time to get out there and pluck some of those delicious figs off the tree. The parable of the fig tree, Matthew 24 and verse 32. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. One of the things, I've watched this tree for 5 years now, and what's so striking is the way it all of a sudden blossoms. Suddenly it produces foliage, and then it's producing figs. I think that's part of the lesson. Verse 33, so you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. We can't know the day and the hour, but Jesus Christ says, know that it is near. If we've got our eyes open, we can know. We can see the general conditions. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. And then verse 42, and we'll finish with this from Jesus Christ, his words. Watch, therefore, you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. Let's keep our eyes open and let's be watchful.